I'm the director and Leon Levy professor, David Nuremberg, and I'm really delighted to introduce you to today's program, Celebrating Great Minds, a discussion between two formidable intellects themselves, David Rubenstein and Walter Isaacson. It's, of course, a bit of a problem to introduce either of these people. I'm not going to try to describe David Rubenstein's achievements, which are monumental. In fact, one of those is the reason for our presence here today. But I will just mention in brief that he was the co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group, the host of the David Rubenstein Show, author of many books, and also a philanthropist who has supported, I can't think of any important cultural institution he hasn't supported. I think if there's any human being who has served on more university boards than David Rubenstein, well, I don't know who it is, including chairing at least two that I know of, Duke and the University of Chicago, which he currently chairs, as well as dedicating his wisdom as a trustee of the Institute for the past 18 years. Walter has an equally impressive resume that extends across many domains. He's a professor of history at Tulane. He's been distinguished fellow and past CEO of the Aspen Institute, the former chairman of CNN, the editor of Time, and he's probably also the most famous biographer of the 21st century. Besides their own, I'm going to call it genius, what makes them the perfect interlocutors for this subject is, on the one hand, the fact that Walter has written about so many innovative and brilliant minds, including Einstein, who will, I think, be the focus of some of their comments today. And on another, David's prescient support of much of what's most important in education, research, and yes, genius in both the sciences and the humanities at the Institute and far, far beyond. So this program is really the most appropriate conceivable celebration and dedication of the opening of our new and already beloved Rubenstein Commons, a place that is designed to invigorate, to challenge, and transform every intellect that enters it. I think many of us have already had this experience, and thereby to carry forward the mission of the Institute, to which we've been dedicated for almost a century now. So please join me in welcoming David Rubenstein and Walter Isaacson.
Thank you very much for coming up from New Orleans to do this. And I think just a day or so ago, you turned in a manuscript about somebody who's well known. It's publicly known that you're writing a book about a very smart person. What's his name? I can't remember.
Elon Musk. It's a memorable name,
Okay.
and he's a memorable person.
So we'll talk about him in a moment.
Too memorable by half sometimes.
So we'll get into that in a moment, but I appreciate your finishing that on time to come up here. Mm-hmm. So we want to talk about Einstein a bit, but before we get into that, I'd like to ask about how you actually came to specialize in people that some people would say are geniuses. So let's go through the list of some of them that you've written about. The first one I think you wrote about was Henry Kissinger, and some people would say he's a genius. Henry would say that.
He would say that,
He would say that, right? So what led you to write a book about him, and is it easier to write a book about a genius who's alive or one who's not alive?
Well, I keep forgetting that the not alive is the correct answer. Indeed, after I did Dr. Kissinger, I said, okay, next time I'm doing somebody who's been dead for 200 years, and moved to Franklin, because it's difficult if they're geniuses. They tend to have a strong personality.
So Henry Kissinger was an immigrant from Germany. He was on the faculty of Harvard, and there are a lot of smart people at Harvard. You're a graduate of Harvard, a Rhodes Scholar as well, so you're pretty well credentialed at Harvard. Was he anything special at Harvard at the time that he was a faculty member, or was he just another
well, he was very, very good at playing the game, and it was wonderful to watch him and Mac Bundy, who was like oil and water, and Mac Bundy, as you know, was the dean of the faculty, and they clashed quite a bit, but then Mac Bundy brings him in as a consultant to the Kennedy administration during the Berlin crisis. while he was a professor at Harvard.
And was Kissinger a Democrat or a Republican then?
You know, those of you who know Einstein well know that light can be both wave and particle, and there was a quantum uncertainty about Dr. Kissinger.
So to go through Kissinger, he became famous for the job he had as National Security Advisor and then later Secretary of State. And one time he had both jobs at the same time.
He said that was the only time in American history that the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State got along.
So is it, now he had a Teutonic accent. And I think I read, by the way, his brother did not have a Teutonic accent.
Yeah, Walter Kissinger.
So how did Walter Kissinger have a normal American accent and...
Yeah, they came over together. When I asked Walter that, he said, because I am the Kissinger who listens.
So Kissinger, because of his accent, I think I got it right, the White House staff did not want him to make any public speeches or go to the White House press room because they thought it would sound like Dr. Strangelove.
Right.
And
that movie had come out, and it was a question of whether it was sort of based on Kissinger, which it wasn't. It was, yeah.
Right. So actually, he came out for the first time the public heard him was when he made his famous speech about peace being at hand. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, that was a famous one that he does in December of '72, right before the election, right. November of '72.
It turned out peace was not at hand. But.
Right, and partly because of him saying that.
So, okay, so he, what is the secret to this attribute of his life? He left government service on January 20th, 1977. He's been out of power for more or less 45 plus years. Mm-hmm. How can somebody be out of power for 45 plus years and still be such a powerful person in the world of foreign policy? You know,
the half-life of celebrity is kind of interesting because why is it that, he doesn't decline? I'll say something, that'll seem earnest and nice, but I really believe that, even though I've had, mixed feelings about some of what he did, which is he is extraordinarily brilliant. And even now, I'm not sure it was with Marilyn and Jim, or it was at some dinner, and Kissinger was there, and it was, what's your biggest worry? He said that this administration will push China into the arms of Russia and vice versa, because Bismarck teaches us never. And it was the most incisive understanding of how to play Russia and China off against each other.
So it was said of Averell Harriman in the Kennedy administration, he was the only ambitious 70-year-old man.
Right.
But Henry Kissinger seems at 99 to be still ambitious. He shows up at meetings, he's still, he's about to be 100.
His 100th birthday will be a phenomenon. It'll be, yes, right.
And I asked him once what the secret to his longevity was. Was it exercising? He didn't think that was it.
No.
Was it eating well?
No.
No, he actually said it was his parents had lived to be in their 90s, I think.
Paula definitely did,
right.
His mother, yeah.
So anyway, in Kissinger's case, what was the attribute that you think he had that no other national security advisor or Secretary of State had that has made him still a prominent force in geopolitics?
Well, in a place like the Institute or around here, in fact, we were talking at lunch today, Rick and Anton Single, about is somebody smart? And that's such a weird word because there's so many attributes that go into intelligence. But there's a particular type of intelligence, I don't mean this in a pejorative way, saying a spider, but a spider in a web can feel the vibrations just from people and from events around the world and understand how they fit into a pattern. And I think Kissinger's ability, whether it was watching Rockefeller playing off against Nixon or China playing off against Russia, is just understanding how a movement in this part of the web is going to ripple here.
Now, in your book about Kissinger, you point out that he had been an advisor to Nelson Rockefeller, and Rockefeller did not turn out to be the nominee of the party in '68, and obviously Nixon got elected. And then Nixon asked Kissinger to be the national security advisor eventually. And Kissinger asked Nelson Rockefeller if it was okay for him to do that. What would he have done if Rockefeller said no?
He was smart enough to know that Rockefeller couldn't possibly say no because he knew he was going to do that job, and he knew that Rockefeller would have to say yes.
Okay. So when your
It's
book,
another example of,
so when your book on Kissinger came out, was he happy with it?
there was somebody, his famous, there's Oscar de la Renta once, gave a big birthday party for Kissinger. And for some reason, I guess Oscar de la Renta wasn't there, gave my book on Kissinger as the gift to everybody at the dinner. It was at the thing. And Kissinger at that point was, was not that fond of all of the book. I think if he reread his own Nobel Peace Prize citation, he'd be outraged that it understated his accomplishments. And so somebody did ask him, well, what did you think of the book? And he said, I liked the title.
So did he ever tell you later on that he was willing to forgive you?
Oh, yeah. You know, once again, I'll pick on Rick because we were at Time Magazine together. We decided to do a big party on the 75th anniversary for everybody who'd been on the cover of Time Magazine. And it was at Radio City, and all these invites go out. And Kissinger at that point still wasn't truly speaking to me much. And the phone rings, and my assistant says, it's Dr. Kissinger on the phone for you. And so I said, pick up the phone, go, hello. He goes, well, Walter. And my first reaction, as yours would have been, is this is either Henry Kissinger or it's Graydon Carter, who does a wonderful Kissinger accent, is trying to trick me, and he'll dine out for, so I go, uh-huh. He says, even the 30 Years' War had to end at some point. I will come to your dinner. I said, well, that's great. And I said, and Nancy, and she said, well, you know, Nancy, she's partial to the 100 Years' War. We're going to have to work on her. But since then, like a moth to flame, he's one of those people who's attracted to his critics. And so he's often asked me to introduce him to get some George Marshall Award or things like that. So
Okay.
I think we've made up.
Made up. Okay, so let's talk about your next person who's a genius, Benjamin Franklin. Mm-hmm. Now, Benjamin Franklin didn't go to Harvard.
You know why? Because he was the 10th son of a Puritan immigrant. He was going to be his father's tithe to the Lord. And so he was going to be sent to Harvard to study, to be a minister. This is a long time ago when Harvard trained ministers, unlike, you know, today. But
Not private equity people.
yeah, and but Franklin wasn't exactly cut for the cloth. And at one point he said to his father, they were saying grace, and they were salting away the provisions for the winter. And he said, let me say grace over them right now. We get it done with once and for all for the entire year. And so his father thought that was so sad, ended up not sending him to Harvard. And there's a wonderful parody of Harvard that Franklin does at like age 15 under the pseudonym of Silence Dogood, about how it only knows how to turn out dunces and blockheads who can enter a room genteelly, something they could have learned less expensively at a dancing school.
So he leaves his native Boston, goes to Philadelphia.
Just leave, he has to. Yeah.
He goes to Philadelphia, works for his brother. Was his brother there?
No, his brother, he was apprenticed to his brother in Boston.
In Boston, and then he went to
and
Philadelphia.
he broke the,
Okay.
he ran away, that's why he had to run away secretly.
All right, he had no money when he got to Philadelphia.
3 coins in his pocket.
So what did he do?
Well, first of all, he tipped the boatman.
Okay.
Secondly, he buys the 3 puffy rolls that are some of the most famous seen in autobiographical literature, and then gives one to a poor woman on the street. And he said, and this is not directed at you, he said, you're always much more generous when you're poor than when you're wealthy, because you don't want people to think you're poor.
Okay. So he gives it away. He has no money left.
Actually,
right?
I don't know why that, I didn't mean
So he has
to
no money
curse
left, right?
He has no money left and walks by the home of Deborah Reed and gets an apprenticeship at a print shop.
And he builds a big printing company, and then he becomes...
He becomes the wealthiest person in the colonies, depending on how you count it, meaning land, lots of people had lots of land.
And he built the postal service.
Because he had a print shop, and he realized that if you have a print shop, you should have the content. So he starts creating a newspaper, and then Poor Richard's Almanac. Other printers were printing Bibles, but he said that didn't make sense because people buy a Bible once in a lifetime. If you print an almanac, they have to buy it every year. And then he becomes so successful that he realizes he's going to franchise print shops up and down the coast, all the way down to Charleston, South Carolina. And then he says, if I own the distribution system, he's like a cable mogul at this point. And so he creates what then becomes the colonial postal system with the U.S. Post Road 1 so that he can control the distribution.
But so he creates this, but then he has a common law wife that he says to her, you run it, and I'm going to England for a while.
Yeah.
Did he ever come back to see her?
He did one. I mean, when he's in England for quite a few years, he takes a break, comes back. But when she's dying, it's right as we're about to have a revolution, and he's still trying to hold it together. And it was a strange. They were common law because she had been married before and her husband had disappeared. And they had a great partnership, but she hated to travel. As far as I can tell, I did a lot of research. She sees him the first time straggling up Market Street with those 3 puffy rolls. They end up marrying later. That she lived every single night of her life on Market Street or within 2 blocks. She never not only left Philadelphia, but never left Market. On the other hand, he's up and down the coast creating the postal system, back and forth to England, back and forth to France. He loved to travel. So it was...
At one point, I thought he stayed in Europe for 10 years at a time. It's something
Yeah,
like
it was,
before he came back.
I mean, I don't remember exactly, but 1750s, he goes over.
And stays celibate there.
He recreates, it's not just a mystery, he recreates a household, Mrs. Stevenson, who's very much like Deborah, with a daughter, and they set up a household there. After Deborah died, he did have 2 famous mistresses in Paris. In fact, Madame Briand, Madame Helvetia said to play chess in the bathtub. This is in the old days when you get away with that. And he was friends with Cunedon, you remember the great philosopher. And Franklin at that point is in his late 70s, and Cunedon's in his late 80s, and Madame Helvetia comes in, and she's in a state of déshabille, which I think means underdressed, let's say. And Cunedon turns to Franklin and says, to be 70 again.
So John Adams is over there.
Yeah.
And he's not quite as adventuresome as...
What Franklin said of Adams, and they had to work together. They were co-envoys for a while until Adams gets persona non grata in Paris. He said that John Adams learned French by reading funeral orations in French. And he said, I learned French by writing bagatelles to my 2 mistresses.
What about Jefferson? Was he okay with the lifestyle that Franklin had?
Oh, he loved Franklin, and he and Franklin bond and get rid of John Adams. Despite McCullough's wonderful treatment of Adams, he was a bit of a priggish individual.
So what inventions did the genius Benjamin Franklin develop that we still have, that we still live with?
Well, the lightning rod was by far the most important scientific invention of that era. And believe it or not, up until then, they thought, lightning was thunderbolts from God. They used to sanctify the steeples of churches to try to, and they would put gunpowder in the church sanctuary to keep it from being, and it kept blowing up. There were just like 250 a year. And Franklin said, maybe we ought to try a different theory. And he was very much a believer in the scientific method, which, by the way, was rather new then in America, which is he would list the attributes, say, of a spark of electricity, of static, and the attributes of lightning. And he'd line them up, and he'd say, well, they're very comparable, let the experiment be made. Now, we think of him as a doddering old dude flying a kite in the rain, but those electricity experiments with the kite are huge. And so he creates the lightning rod and doesn't patent it.
And does he really discover electricity in the sense of...
He discovers that electricity is a flow from negative to positive. He comes up with the words negative and positive, plus and minus, battery, he invents that
And we
phrase.
still use those.
Yeah, and the single fluid theory of electricity is probably the most important of that decade. I mean, he didn't discover electricity. I mean,
It was there.
but it was there.
All right, but what about bifocals? That was his idea too?
Yeah, because he was always traveling up and down on the postal road that he had helped create and reading and looking, and so he had them made in the Franklin stove.
And so he was the most famous American at the time, is that right?
Especially in France, where they first proved his electricity experiments and they first proved the lightning rod. I mean, he was, other than Jerry Lewis, we've never had somebody who was so sanctified in France from America.
So of all the
I love being in the crowd of people who actually know who Jerry Lewis is.
So of all the geniuses, we'll talk about a couple more in a moment, I thought you once told me if you could have dinner with any one person that you've written about, it would be Franklin. Is that right?
Well, he's the most pleasant. Geniuses, as people at the Institute may know, are not often pleasant dinner companions.
Really? I didn't know that. Okay, so let's go to another person that people say is a genius in the business world, Steve Jobs.
Absolutely.
So how did that book come about? Because did he call you and say, you should write about me, I'm a genius like Franklin or Kissinger?
Yeah.
Or how did that come about?
We actually did. We took a walk. I had just joined the Aspen Institute, and he said, let's go for a walk. I didn't realize taking a walk was, and he said, well, do me next. And I did say to myself, well, actually, I may have said it to him. I said, yeah, Franklin, Einstein, you arrogant little, but I didn't. And I said, I'll do you in 30, 40 years when you retire. And then somebody who you know called and said, well, if you're going to do them, you're going to have to do them now. And I said, well,
he had a medical
yeah,
problem.
and I said, well, I didn't know. He said, well, he was diagnosed the day before he called you. He called you the
With
day after he was
pancreatic cancer.
diagnosed with pancreatic. That's why I didn't know. He said, well, he hasn't even told his board, but that's why. And then I realized this is a person who transformed our lives totally. I mean, every industry, from the personal computer, one you could just take out of a box and plug in, to retail stores, to music, to movies, to phones. And so very rarely do we try to get at the roots of genius in business and in innovation. And I thought this would be an enormous opportunity to spend time with him.
So he didn't graduate from college. I think he spent one semester at Reed, basically. Did he ever tell you why he didn't want to get a college degree? He didn't think he needed it, or he wanted to go invent the computer? What did he really want to do?
He was just pure wanderlust. The big difference, and we may get to it in a minute, I don't mean to jump ahead, but you know, Bill Gates, when he goes to college, studies only applied math. Harvard didn't have a CS, a computer science department then, but he does apply. Whereas Jobs, who was somewhat interested in technology, only took calligraphy, dance, music, poetry, whatever. And he said that that was by standing at the intersection of the humanities and technology. That was the special thing he brought to the party.
So people forget that he was thrown out of the company he started.
Sure.
And was out of the company, I think, for, was it 12 years or 14 years, something like that?
He gets thrown out in 1985, famously after the 1984 introduction of the Mac. He gets brought back in 1998 or 9, I think.
So he's out for a long time, and actually he sold all of his stock except for one share. So when he got back to the company and built it up, he actually wasn't the biggest shareholder. Had he held onto the stock, he would have been by 10 times the richest man in the world, but he actually didn't own that much stock compared to what he would have owned had he not.
You know Larry
away.
Ellison probably. So he's saying, I want to go back to Apple, and I want to, find a way back in because they had screwed up Apple. And Ellison says, fine, and we should buy up a whole lot of stock and do it. And Steve said, I don't want to do that. I don't want to buy a lot of stock and try to do it for that reason. And Ellison says, well, Steve, if you don't buy up stock and then do it, how are you going to make a lot of money? And he said, I looked at Ellison and put both hands on my shoulders and said, Larry, you already have enough money. You don't need to do things only motivated that way.
Where did the name Apple come from?
Well, he worked on a Apple commune, he and Steve Wozniak. That's what they did on weekends. And when they were first building this computer, he tells Wozniak, you've got to code it by the weekend because we have to get back to the apple orchard where they were working. And Woz says, well, I can't finish the coding. They were working at Atari at the time, the night shift, because Steve didn't shower, and so they put him on the night shift.
Well, you mentioned that in the book. Well, he never showered, so people didn't want to work with him, so they made him work at night when no one else was there. Is that right?
He went to India and found a guru, the Maharaji, who had been John Lennon's guru, who told him if he ate only vegetables and fruit, I mean a pure vegan diet, he didn't have to shower and use deodorant. And he was working at Atari, so I went to Al Alcorn, who was then heart of, and he said, that was a mistaken theory. That's why I put him on the night shift.
He didn't wear shoes either.
Correct. Einstein doesn't wear socks, he doesn't wear shoes.
Okay.
But real quickly on getting back to Woz, he tells Woz, you've got to code it, and he does a trick that his guru used to do on him, which is he stared at Woz without blinking and said, don't be afraid, you can do it, don't be afraid. So Woz finally codes the game, and when they form the company, they decide to call it Apple, after the apple orchard, and because they wanted to get ahead of Atari in the phone book.
So if there had been no Wozniak, who actually had some technical skills, could Steve Jobs have created Apple, or you needed Wozniak because he had the technical skills?
In life, we who are biographers have a dirty little secret. We distort history some. We make it seem like a guy or a gal goes to a garage and has a light bulb moment. And it's always about teams, whether it's Lennon and McCartney, or you can pick it on, whether it's whatever basketball team you want, or for that matter, Ballmer and Gates, or sometimes a team like Noyce and Andy Grove and Gordon Moore. And it was a perfect synergy of a team, which is a very reclusive Woz who can do the engineering, and Steve who knew how to make it into a company.
In your book, you keep talking about the fact that he was so focused on design that he would give the designers criticisms of the design. He was more focused on the design of the product and how it would work than actually some of the, I'd say, complication and technology part of it.
Yeah, well, first of all, his father, his adoptive father, who was a dropout, told him one thing, which is beauty matters. And when they built a fence around the backyard of his house near Cupertino, a little tract home where he grew up, he said, we have to make the back of the fence just as beautiful as the front. And Steve said, why? Nobody's going to see it. Nobody's ever going to know. He said, yes, but you will know. So when they do the original Macintosh, not only does he get the chamfers and curves of the case beautiful, goes to Macy's to look at Cuisinart machines, but when they're about to finish it, he looks at the circuit board inside and tells the engineers, this sucks. And they said, what do you mean? He said, it's ugly. They said, but it's inside a case. Nobody will see it. Nobody will know. And he told them the story of his father, saying you have to make it even beautiful, the parts unseen.
So one of the most interesting parts of that book was Steve was interested in finding out who his biological father was. Mm-hmm. He had a chance to meet him for the only time in his life, really, and he chose not to do so. Can you go back and explain how he came to realize who his biological father was and why he didn't want to meet him?
Yes, he first of all finds out that Mona Simpson, the great novelist, is his biological sister. Because the mother had raised Mona but put Steve up for adoption. And so Mona and Steve get together.
The biological mother and father were not married at the time.
Right.
Steve was
the
conceived.
biological father is a guy named John Dindali, who was from Homs, Syria, and then from Lebanon, but mainly from Syria, and was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin and gets Mrs. Simpson pregnant or whatever. And so Mona is born, they reunite, and they decide they're going to find the lost father, which is the name of one of Mona's novels. And they go to California. They're able to track him down eventually, that he's running a coffee shop in Sacramento. And when they get near there, Steve says, I don't want to go inside, I don't want to meet him. Mona goes in, introduces herself, because he had remembered Mona, because Mona had been raised by his ex-wife, and starts crying and saying, and says, you have a brother too. And he said, I just wish you could have seen me in better circumstances, because this is a bad little roadside coffee shop. He said, I used to own a great Middle Eastern restaurant in San Jose. And it was, everybody used to come there. Even Steve Jobs used to come there. And Mona catches herself and doesn't say, Steve is your son. She goes back to see Steve, who's waiting, saying, I'm not going to go meet this guy, but goes back to see him in Sacramento, and tells him this. And he says, that guy was my father, and refused ever to see him.
So Steve is diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, but he chooses to use homeopathic kind of medicine, I guess.
Yeah.
You're not a doctor, I know, but do you think that had he gone to the conventional Western medical treatment process, pancreatic cancer is complicated, but do you think he might have lived longer? Or
Yeah, he definitely might have lived longer. Obviously, we don't know. It took 9 months, and before he even had the half-Whipple procedure or whatever. And he tried to do it with, as Art Levinson, the chair of his board, said, excuse my language here, horseshit and horseshit roots, meaning he just ate all this organic stuff, and it didn't help. And Steve had a reality distortion field. He felt that if something was there that he didn't like, he could just will it away. And he often used that to get Apple to do things everybody thought was impossible. And he would do that trick I mentioned about the guru, and stare without blinking. One of the things you can't will away that way is cancer. And he regretted it, that he didn't get treatment.
So you wrote a book about Leonardo.
Yeah.
So widely considered to be one of the great geniuses of all time. What attracted you to Leonardo? And you had to go back and deal with something hundreds of years old. Was that complicated to go back?
Well, also it was one of those things after Kissinger's like, man, I'm going to go back 200 years after dealing with this guy. Then I'd forgotten how bad it was. So then I do it with Steve. It's like, oh man, I'm going to go back 500 years this time. But it was actually Jobs who helped convince me, because he said, you got to do Leonardo next. And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, I did not know this, but he pointed it out to me. The theme of all of your books is people who stand at the intersection of the arts and sciences, whether it's Ben Franklin or Steve Jobs or whatever, Einstein as well. And he said the ultimate of that is Leonardo, and the ultimate symbol of it is Vitruvian Man, is the icon of the intersection of the arts and sciences. And I realized it was true that most of us think of Leonardo as an artist. But if you look at the way he identifies himself all the time, it says the engineer and artist to the Duke of Milan. And I wanted to treat him not as an artist, but as somebody who did not make a distinction between engineering and art.
So in your book, you point out that we only have a limited number of paintings that he completed that are still around.
Well, you would know it better than anybody, because Ginevra da Vinci, as you know, is...
There's only one Da Vinci in the United States. It's
right,
at the
and
National
you've
Gallery of
helped
Art.
make sure that it stays at the National Gallery of Art.
But why did he not finish more paintings? He seemed to start these paintings and carry them around. He never seemed to finish them.
Well, he was definitely a perfectionist, and he really finishes, I'd say, 12 paintings. You can argue, St. Jerome in the Wilderness, is it finished or not? And it was because he was always believing there was something more, something of a brushstroke. And he was a procrastinator, too. And he also did not feel any... I mean, he had to leave Florence because he had so many uncommissioned... That's why he goes to Milan.
So the most famous painting in the world is the Mona Lisa. Mm-hmm. Why is it so famous?
Well, because it's actually the greatest piece of art ever done on wood, I should say, not canvas. And it's done because it's a great intersection of art and science. For example, in order to understand how light comes off things, he dissected the human eye. He spent a lot of time dissecting.
Was it easy to get bodies to dissect? Or?
Not easy, but in fact, and also a little bit contrary to the teaching of the church, so he gets in trouble. But he's at the mortuaries doing the dissection, and he understands how light hits the retina of the eye, and that the light, I'm going to give just one example of the Mona Lisa, I'll give you 100 of them, but that the light coming directly to the center of your retina shows color and, shows detail very, very well. But as it comes in separately, you kind of see the shadows and colors better. And so if you look at the lips of the Mona Lisa, the most famous smile ever, and you look very carefully, the details on each end actually go down slightly. She's not smiling. And if you look directly at her lips, you don't think she's smiling. But if your head turns slightly, the colors and the shadows are moving upward. And so as your head moves ever so slightly, you watch that smile interacting with you and coming on and off. That was an example, one of probably 20 I could give you, of his science informing his art.
So he was a rival of someone named Michelangelo. Did they get along? Or?
Not at all. Florence wasn't big enough for both of them. And they were incredibly different. I mean, Leonardo is a proud misfit. He's come from the village of Vinci as a person born out of wedlock, left-handed, gay, distracted, flamboyant, has many, many friends, has a posse, dresses in purple and magenta. And Michelangelo, also gay, but if you've read The Agony and the Ecstasy or anything, is totally tortured by it. You know, wears only these black coats, never socializes with anybody. And Florence is a very small town, and they were great rivals.
So let's talk about Albert Einstein. So to do
his spiritual home here, man, he loved these sacred grounds.
So Albert Einstein, he's the, when you say Albert Einstein, it's almost equivalent in the Roget's thesaurus for genius.
Yes, right.
When did that actually happen? During the 1920s, the 30s, the 40s? When did the name Einstein become almost synonymous with genius?
Well, it certainly happens a little bit late. One of the great things is he goes to the Zurich Polytech, and when he applies the first time, he gets rejected. And I thought, God, I've really got to find the name of the person at the Zurich Polytech who rejected Albert Einstein. It was Heinrich Weber, who was a great physicist. It was like, okay, this guy isn't good. But finally, Einstein comes. Weber never ends up liking him. Einstein, even after the miracle year of 1905, with the papers that give you the two post-holes of 20th century physics, relativity and quantum, in 1905, he's a third-class examiner in the patent office in Bern because he can't get his doctorate because the dissertation he submitted is too confusing for people. In 1906, after he's transferred, he's still a third class. He does not, until 1909, get an assistant professorship.
So who were his parents? Were they geniuses?
They were engineers, and every biography of a great man or complex man, rule one is it's all about dad, whether it's Ben Franklin, Einstein, Steve Jobs. And Einstein's father, Heinrich, was an engineer who went bankrupt twice trying to create electricity in both the city of Pavia and then in Milan, creating generators in which the coils, back then, before people fully grokked Maxwell's equations, if the magnet moves through the coil, it generates electricity, and if the coil moves in relation to the magnet, it makes an electromagnetic field. If you believe in relativity, those have to be the same thing, but they didn't know it at the time. I'm getting too detailed here, but his father tries to create these generating machines and goes bankrupt, and Einstein himself is like always trying to make up for that.
The conventional wisdom often is that Einstein wasn't too good in kindergarten. In fact, he barely talked till he was 3 or 4.
Slow in learning how to
true?
speak as a child. So slow that they consulted a doctor. They called him the dopey one, der Deporté, in the family because he would have trouble speaking. He said, though, that that was part of his strength was two things. He didn't speak very well, so he always thought visually, like when his dad gives him that compass famously.
His father gave him a compass, and he loved that compass, right?
Yeah, because the needle is twitching and pointing north, but nothing's touching it. And he becomes mesmerized, no pun intended, by the concept of a force field, something that's a field that has no substance, but it touches something and moves it. And for the rest of his life, until his deathbed a few blocks away, he's still trying to figure out a field theory that'll, and he said his palms would sweat, trying to figure this out as a kid. Now, I remember what was causing my, we remember getting a compass, right? Like, oh, look, and then a minute or two later, oh, a dead squirrel, and we're on to something else. His whole life, he's still worrying about this.
So was he considered by his classmates in high school or college a brilliant person or just reasonably intelligent?
Reasonably intelligent at the Zurich Polytech even. As I say, he's the only person in his class, with the exception of Mileva, the only woman who then becomes his wife, not to get a job offer at any university. And those of you who live near Princeton can understand what that would mean. You know, getting a degree but not being offered any job.
And do you think that was because he was Jewish?
Not exactly then, but it's a very good question, because we're talking here 1901, 1902, and the anti-Semitism. But you have to remember, he does get made a member of the Prussian Academy when they finally prove the theory of relativity. And so he does ascend the greatest of all heights in the epicenter of anti-Semitism.
And some people say that his first wife helped him with some of his scientific work.
Yeah,
Is that
you know,
fair?
he always said that, believe it or not, he never had enough math. And he did not realize, he said his greatest mistake was not realizing at first that math is the language that explains physics or nature to you. And Mileva was a very good mathematician, so she helped check the math.
And was he a very good husband?
Not great, and they have a very complicated life. And my favorite story of that is when they finally decide to get a divorce. And by the way, this is after 1905. He's written these miracle year papers, including E equals MC squared. And by 1907, 1908, they decide they want a divorce. But he has no money. He's still a second-class patent clerk. And he says to her, one of these days, one of those papers will win the Nobel Prize. If you give me a divorce instead of me giving you money or whatever of it, I will give you all the money from the Nobel Prize when that happens. And she's very smart, and she had, you know, and she consults with 3 or 4 people, including Heinrich Weber and Habicht and others, to figure out what are the chances that he will win the Nobel Prize. She takes the bet. It's not until 1919, I think, or 1923, 1919 is the eclipse, that he, or 21, he wins the Nobel Prize. She gets all the money and she buys 2 apartment buildings in Zurich.
$25,000.
Yeah. Was that how much?
I thought it was about $25,000.
Oh, I thought, well, it's now $1 million, yeah.
Well, in today's things.
I'm not a banker, yeah.
Let's go on. What happened in 1905?
You mean, the Miracle Year papers are him just doing these visual thought experiments. One of the interesting things about him being trapped as a patent clerk, let me just take one in particular, which is the Swiss had just gone on standard time zones. And those of you who know Swiss people, they tend to be quite Swiss. You know, they really care that if it strikes the hour in Basel, at the exact same instant, it's going to strike it in Bern. And so they have to have a device that will synchronize clocks. And 28 of his patent applications from 1903 to 1905 involve synchronizing clocks by sending a signal. And the signal travels at the speed of light. And ever since he was a young kid trying to figure out Maxwell's equations, he kept imagining the thought experiment of catching up with a light beam and how it should look stationary, but Maxwell's equations don't allow for that. So he's trying to figure out, why is it that the speed of light is always constant no matter what your state of motion? And he's looking at these devices to synchronize clocks, and he comes up with this brilliant leap that what looks synchronized in terms of 2 clocks, because the train goes right beneath his window with the clock tower of Bern. He said, if you're moving really fast in one direction, what looks synchronized is different than somebody's moving fast in another direction, and that if you can't have absolute synchronimity, is that the word? You know, you can't say something's absolutely synchronous, then time is also not absolute. It's relative depending on your state of motion. So that's the typical leap of the imagination he did in 05, and then he does quantum
But he
too.
writes, how many, 4 papers or 5 papers?
Well, he writes 4 papers in this famous letter to his friend.
But why did he not get the Nobel Prize right away for this incredible work that he came up with, the theories of relativity?
Well, first of all, he couldn't even get a job for 4 years after that because nobody believed, wait a minute, time is, because Newton tells us, first paragraph of the Principia, time marches along second by second, irrespective of how we observe it, and he's trying to say no. So they don't quite get it. Nobody, he generalizes the theory, I won't get into that, in 1915, 16, and still nobody's absolutely sure, and they are calling it Jewish science by this point because it's relativity. And it's not until the eclipse of 1919 when they can see the bending of light as it goes through the gravitational
Then it's
field
proven,
of the sun.
then he becomes famous.
That's when he, to answer your question in the very beginning, which I forgot to answer, it's that, when that eclipse observation happens, he becomes world famous and wins the Nobel. For quantum, though, not for
Yeah,
relativity.
but he didn't win it for relativity, for something else, and they, okay, so.
Well, quantum theory is not just something else, but yeah.
But it wasn't, it wasn't what he thought he was going to win it for, but let's say, so what was the story with the hair? Why did he never, why couldn't he comb his hair a little bit?
You know, the thought experiment is if he didn't have that wild halo of hair, you know, if he had looked just like Niels Bohr or somebody, would he still be considered such a genius? Was it a great marketing thing? I think at a certain point, he just told some school children, he said, you know, I'm just very, very busy. There's no reason for me to waste time combing my hair.
What about the violin? He loved to play the violin. Was he any good at it?
Controversy. I mean, people, everybody loved to hear him play. He'd love to play Mozart. And he said whenever he was having trouble with the math in particular on general relativity, and he was quite a loner, all the more so because he's by this point at the Prussian Academy and in Berlin, where he's having trouble as an outsider. And he said, whenever I'm having trouble figuring out the tensor calculus he was trying to do, he said, I pick up my violin and play Mozart because it connects me to the harmonies of the spheres.
So how did he actually come to the Institute? The Institute was just starting. He presumably didn't know it that well.
Yeah, Abraham Flexner, as you all know, founded the Institute. And Flexner is just really intent on collecting the greatest geniuses. And he goes out to see Robert Millikan, who is then running Caltech, and that's where Einstein was. This is 1932. So Einstein thinks he's going to go back to Germany, but as 1932 progresses, he becomes clearer and clearer that he might never get back to his beloved house on the lake near Berlin. And Flexner goes there, and Millikan is furious because he's trying to recruit Einstein. And Flexner, in a gesture of politesse, stops trying to recruit him for a while and waits until Einstein has gone to Oxford for one semester, Christchurch, Oxford, and goes and takes a walk in Tom Quad and offers him the job at Princeton, which was only going to be one of 4 jobs. Einstein was going to try to juggle them.
How much was he offered?
He was offered, first of all, Flexner says to him, how much do you think you should get? And Einstein, who didn't have a head for finance, said, I don't know, I could live off $3,000 a year. So Flexner says, well, that's ridiculous, and offers him $10,000. Ups it, negotiating him upward. And then, there was a great mathematician here. Somebody can shout out the name. Veblen. Huh? Veblen. Veblen also, I guess Oswald Veblen's, Veblen, who was making $15,000. And that's when Flexner finally raises his salary to $15,000.
I thought
his second wife ends up negotiating.
She's a tougher negotiator. And who was his second wife? Was she related to him?
First cousin, cousin twice.
And
mother's side and father's
from his
side.
First wife, he had a child out of wedlock before they were married.
Lisa.
And nobody knows what happened to that child.
Great mystery, just like Ben Franklin, a lot of you have these. And we don't quite ever know what happened to Lee Earl.
But he has, when he's married to his first wife, he has 2 children. What happened to those 2 children?
And then there's Hans Albert, who is, I think, still with us. He was an engineering professor at Caltech for a long time and had to keep walking by the Einstein bust at the Athenaeum, which I think gave him some problems. And then, unfortunately, a beautiful kid named Edward, who ends up with schizophrenia in an asylum in Germany, which is not a good place to be. And
did Einstein
30s.
like his time at the Institute, or did he? How long
He
was
loved
here?
it. In fact, he was supposed to, as I say, be at 3 other places. Oxford had offered him thing, and of course Milk had at Caltech, and he was going to juggle it. And once he gets here, and then Elsa finds 112 Mercer Street, he just thinks it's heaven. He does have a wonderful line, something, a lot of semi-dwarfs on stilts prancing around, which is what he says
So
of
what about the
Princeton.
apocryphal story that he couldn't remember how to get to his house?
He does at one point call the dean of the institute, who's not in, so he gets an assistant, and says, "Can you tell me where Albert Einstein lives?" And this, you think it's apocryphal, but enough people have told me this, and the person says, "I'm sorry, we're not allowed to give out that address." And there's a long pause, and he says, "Well, I am Dr. Einstein, and I've forgotten my address." At which point, he says, 112.
So after, let's say, 1920 or so, was he really at the cutting edge of physics, or was he?
No.
He was not at that point a major figure in the
It
physics
is,
world.
well, he was a major figure, but it was so interesting. One of his strengths was his contempt for authority. Like, I'll read the first paragraph of Newton's Principia, and I'll say, no, I disagree. And he said, God punished me for my contempt of authority by making me an authority myself. And so what he does is he becomes resistant to the new physics. The most important advances in theoretical physics of the 20th century come out of that quantum paper he does in 1905 and the other quantum things. And yet by 1915, he's resisting the implications of quantum theory, which basically say that there's an inherent randomness at the subatomic level. And he keeps famously saying, I cannot believe that God plays dice with the universe. At one point, he says it, and he says, here at Princeton, at the old Fine Hall, if some of you remember, I think it was a math building, right? He says, arguing against it, subtle is the Lord, but malicious he is not, meaning God wouldn't play dice, which is carved still, somebody tell me if I'm right, tell me, is it still carved on the mantle, right? Still there. So he's resisting the implications of quantum.
So he dies in 1955.
I think, yeah.
And it is said that at the time that he died, he didn't want to be kept artificially alive. He said, my time.
Well, he had an aorta, and they offered him surgery because it was starting to rupture, and he said, no, my time has come.
It is said that an unauthorized effort was undertaken by a doctor to remove his brain.
Thomas Harvey at the Princeton Hospital takes his brain out, even though he wanted to be cremated, but keeps the brain.
And the brain was later examined by brain specialists, and what did they conclude?
Not much. I mean, I went through all sorts of literature of people.
I thought there was something like the synapses were 15% greater or something like that.
But I'm not even sure that
Okay.
account. I don't think we can brain map and say this
Okay.
guy's a genius.
So,
But, I do want to say, though, when he's at Princeton Hospital, he refuses the thing, and he knows he's dying. He asks Helen Dukas to go by the office here and bring him his papers. And there's that last night where after the visitors had left, he does 12 more pages. They're at Hebrew University. I wish they were here, because I went to Hebrew University to see him. 12 more pages of equations with math mistakes, crossing them out, doing line after line, still trying to get the unified field theory that would overcome uncertainty at the quantum level.
He was trying to prove that there's a theory that makes everything
He's
understood.
trying to figure out why does the compass needle twitch and point north. And you see the last line when his art bursts, it just dribbles down.
So you've now finished a couple years spending time with Elon Musk. I won't ask you to talk about the book that's going to be coming out, but when will it come out?
Probably this fall. We're still dealing,
Okay.
I mean, it's a movable feast.
And you've put him in the category of genius as well?
Yeah, I mean, all geniuses have, all geniuses are different, as Jane Austen would have said. But his genius is understanding the intersection of physics and engineering and the physics of properties. And we were talking about it at lunch today, because he's totally mad and totally crazy and totally, problematic at times. And yet, over and over again, whether it comes to deciding to start Tesla and figuring out the lithium-ion batteries, the year GM decides to get out of the EV business and being successful, and I think his company is now worth the next 9 car companies combined, or being the only entity that can get astronauts into orbit from the United States. Even NASA and Boeing can't do that anymore. So he keeps succeeding, and the book is about, if he's this crazy, what accounts for this success? There's a line that Steve Jobs wrote at the end of the ad that he writes when he finally gets back to Apple in '99. It's a beautiful ad. It says, "Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the round pegs in the square hole." And I remember Steve Jobs in his backyard reciting that to me. My heart started to cry. I thought he had something in his eye, but he was crying by the end. And it ends with, because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. And in some ways, that's a bit of the theme of the Musk book.
So do you get people calling you all the time saying, well, Walter, maybe you could write a book about me?
Yeah,
because,
yeah.
And so...
I ought to give you the names. You'd be amused by them, but I won't say them publicly. I mean, it does, and they, you know, they're offering, and they think, you know, I'll do it if they just get the price right. I said, no, I actually don't write these.
So anybody in the private equity world called you and said they should have a book about that? That hasn't happened yet?
Yeah, 2 people, you know.
Okay, Walter.
The widow of one and one you know.
Walter, I want to thank you for a great conversation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.